Good afternoon and welcome back. So we'll continue with our unit on social psychology. And in this class, we'll go on to prosocial and antisocial behavior and some of their applications. So how might you experience good teamwork or workplace bullying? There are some content warnings for this lecture. So we do raise the topics of discrimination, harassment, sexual violence, and misandry. And as usual, I have blue screened those sections. I had been looking forward to Crystal Lowe, who is going to present to us about the Sexual Violence Prevention Initiative here at St. Mary's. However, she had something come up. Therefore, I have posted resources she provided to Brightspace under the news section. There is an opportunity, which I think is quite different and quite exciting, to get involved in policy formation. So a policy workshop was held on Monday. There'll be another one on the 18th, and there's also a survey that you can participate in. So evolution prepares us to identify with a group. Our in-group are the people that we identify with, okay? And there's a dark side of that too, and that's when groups come into conflict with other groups. We have a hardwired tendency to favor the groups that we belong to. We can find ourselves in competition with people from other groups. Jenkins and Steele describe a study, maybe it was some kind of workplace retreat setting, I don't quite recall. And the researchers started by giving participants a survey with all kinds of personal questions. Then they put people into 3 groups. One had high power, one had middle power, and one group had low power. The high power group controlled the resources that need to be asked for permission. The people in the lower power group had to hand over their keys and wallets, the people in the higher power group. There were pretty big behavioral differences between the people in the 3 groups. And so the people in the higher power group may have seemed very sort of competent and in control, and the people in the lower power group seemed maybe very irresponsible or immature. And at the end of the study, the participants thought that the surveys that they got at the beginning were just amazing at predicting how people behaved, because that's what they thought. They thought the assignment was based on survey answers, on personality differences, but actually they were randomly assigned to the groups. And what was really being manipulated and what was predicting behavior was the differences in power that they were being assigned to. So we want to believe in a just world where the good are rewarded and the bad are punished. And that's a very deep need. It's deep enough for us to rationalize the results of inequality back to personal differences that maybe didn't really matter or really have the influence on outcomes. Fun fact, there are many practical reasons why things end up that way, but leadership and followership don't essentially require a power difference to work. And a good example of this is ballroom dance. The lead doesn't have more power than the follow. There's no coercion. They're equals. It takes 2 to tango. What there is a division of labor or roles where the lead has the big picture strategy, like they're spotting the room, making sure you don't crash into other couples. They provide a strong frame. And if that's executed well, then it frees the follower, who's dancing backwards, can't see where they're going, to do fancy stuff, right? All the spins and the dips and the twirls, and to fall into a drop knowing that they'll be caught. Making that work doesn't require a power difference, but it does require shared goals, mutual respect, and excellent communication. In Quaker classrooms, there's no power difference between the teacher and the students, no use of titles for the teacher. You don't really need that to teach or to learn, but they do tend to have small groups and to sit in circles instead of having a setup like this. So equality can work in pairs and in small groups, and that's usually where we find it in large groups, in societies, you lose that ability to form relationships and to communicate as effectively. And then we start to see these big power differences form. They can get pretty dysfunctional. So in this picture, just looking at the body language, who do you think has the power in that relationship? Does it look like one person has more power than the other? Yes. And why would you say that? What is her body language doing?
More assertive.
Just telling him how it is. And she's going into his personal space, sort of expanding into it. And he's kind of got his, what else do you see? Yes. Very good. Yes. Avoiding eye contact. She's staring right at him and he's dropping his gaze, kind of looking down. Anything else? What emotion is she expressing? Yeah, frustration or anger. And what emotion is he expressing? Ooh, that's a good question. Like, is it a feeling that's associated with thought and observable actions? That's interesting. I think he is in the submissive position. Yes. Yeah, he looks tired. Not a lot of fight in there. I would say he looks a little shamed too. So anger is seen as appropriate for people who are dominant, and shame is appropriate for people who are submissive. Okay, so if people are seen as having low status or power in a group and they're angry, that anger can be constructed very negatively, as dangerous, as out of control, as inappropriate. Whereas the anger isn't questioned in the higher power group. So there are differences in power and social life, and those differences are important. They predict and they constrain behavior. Sometimes you can't behave in a way you would like because you don't have the power to do so. And those differences exist between individuals, they exist within groups, and they exist between groups. There are contexts in your life where you are the dominant party, even if it's only over your dog or your babysitting charges. And there are contexts in your life where you're in the submissive position. Right? We all have a boss, even if it's your parents. Over time, those relationships can get more complex. They have their ways of showing up in society and the workplace. Some people have traits or preferences that lean one way or the other. Right? Some people will manifest more social dominance across situations. Okay? Some people seek to be in charge. Some people want to find a good leader. So what do these behaviors look like in really broad strokes? Well, the dominant person, the person who has power over, has the control. They administer rewards and punishments. If you are operant conditioning your dog, you have the power over your dog. Okay? And then the person in the submissive position, the person who's under the power of someone, is controlled. They're the one who is rewarded and is punished. Okay? The dominant person is often more independent. You might say, I am who I say I am, instead of having an identity that's based on other people's narratives and seeking approval with them. You know, am I being a good student? Right? Am I being a good teacher? Right? Relying on some other narrative, checking yourself against that. Right? Versus very confidently asserting your own identity, even if it clashes with some social narratives. So the person in the dominant position decides and acts, whereas the person in the submissive position receives and reacts. The dominant person holds the frame and creates and enforces structure. That syllabus, I wrote it. You have to comply with it. Okay? They decide what's right, what's true, what's appropriate, what's funny. Okay, and then the person in the submissive position acts within the frame or the structure. They might seek permission and approval. Person in the dominant role often has a judging kind of function, whereas the person in the submissive capacity sort of explains. You'll see this in like length of emails. If you're in the sort of submissive position, you might write really long emails explaining things to somebody. Maybe it's your boss, maybe it's your teacher, who then writes back something really short that contains kind of a decision based on their analysis, because they're in the judging role. So you see a lot more talking, a lot more disclosure, a lot more personal disclosure in the submissive position. And I was thinking of that when I said, when you ask for an extension, don't tell me why, right? It shows that you're in charge of your life. You know that you need a bit more time to do this, and I'm not judging whether that's sort of appropriate or not, okay? Tends to have a sort of protecting or providing role, showing strength instead, versus seeking safety or comfort or presenting needs. See a lot of confidence in leadership versus being sort of fearful or anxious and seeking safety and trusting, okay? You can sometimes tell who's in a submissive role because they're often the first one to show sort of age regression. So like playful behavior, more childlike, or emotions could come across as resentful versus sort of parental. It's about sort of guiding and indulging or staying calm. Somebody in a dominant role may be angry. Their anger is accepted and seen as appropriate. Whereas somebody in a submissive role is expected to be grateful and maybe they feel shame. So shaming somebody is a power move. A dominant person has to show competence. Otherwise, if they have power, they're being abusive. Okay? And then people in submissive roles are expected to be obedient. Right? You do what you're told. Emotionally, a dominant person might feel like they need to be needed, whereas the person in the submissive position wants to be wanted. There are nonverbal cues where you can read this kind of stuff looking around a room. Okay? Smiling is considered a submissive gesture, okay? Even in chimpanzees. It's noticed that during MMA matches, the one who smiles to the other opponent is more likely to lose the match. Seeming impressed, right, with someone else's greatness or strength. As you mentioned, looking down, right, staring is kind of a dominant behavior. Having wide open eyes, more blinking. Having a sort of half closed eye can be a bit threatening. What else? Tilting the head, especially lowering it in order to look up. Any kind of body posture that makes you look small or unstable demonstrates more submission. So versus standing with feet planted apart, it would be standing in a way that's kind of tippy, that throws your weight. Okay, crossing your hands, sort of protective gestures. What else? So a more dominant way to stand would be to have, like, let's say, hands in fists, right? Versus palms up and open. That really says I'm not a threat. Okay. Leaning on objects versus standing tall. Anxious looking behaviors like fidgeting and nail biting and jerky movements instead of controlled movements. Clothing that is sort of soft or casual looking versus clothing that is structured and tailored. And I'd say the classic clothing pieces for structured clothing would be a suit. Very often, if you're in a room, the person that has the power is wearing some kind of a blazer. There are also verbal cues. So people in a dominant position will speak less generally. They'll make a statement or a decision. Sometimes people who are in more powerless positions will make a statement in a way that sounds like a question. So listen to the intonation of my voice when I ask you a question. How are you? It kind of goes up at the end. Now I'm going to state a fact. The sky is blue. Doesn't go up, my voice, does it? Okay. But now I'm going to make that statement and make it sound like a question. The sky is blue? It's like I'm checking for your approval to see if you agree that that's true. Okay. Dominant people tend to talk less, and people in submissive positions tend to talk more. There's more explaining, right? Reporting, checking in. You also hear it in the pitch of the voice. So more dominant people have a lower pitch. In fact, there's a research study that shows that you can influence people simply by lowering the pitch of your voice in the first moments of a conversation. In women, you hear more vocal fry. Do you know what vocal fry is? Am I doing it right now? So the lowest vocal register for a woman is the vocal fry range. So you hear more fry in the voice. So versus a softer voice. Doesn't even feel natural. Okay, on to aggression. So aggression is behavior that is defined by intent to physically or emotionally harm. And I have both there because they're both important. You know that we feel social pain in the same parts of the brain that feel physical pain. So there's physical aggression where you can physically hurt somebody. And then there's relational aggression where you can hurt their feelings and their reputation and their sense of identity. It's where people go with, say, emotional abuse. Aggression is, like all labels, partly a social construct. We agree that this is aggression. So, but if, let's say, these soldiers are on your side, they're not aggressors, okay? They're heroes. Now, if you're on the other side of that conflict, they're aggressors. This hunter, is he aggressing against that? Is it a deer? No, he's just getting food, right? But if you were in PETA, you might definitely see that as aggression. This picture here is of a Western farmer's cows. We don't see that as aggression. That's just farming, according to best farming practices. A Hindu might see that as a very inappropriate and aggressive way to treat a cow. These are dogs in Asia, where dogs are sold for meat. That's not seen as aggression or as mistreating a dog. It would be seen that way here, where dogs are definitely off the menu and can be sort of like proxies for children. So aggression is partly a social construct. We do a lot of things that harm other beings physically or emotionally. We may or may not label that as aggression. Aggression does have adaptive value. It's one way to get resources. There are groups of people that try not to perpetrate aggression. So there are pacifist groups. Jains were wearing masks before we all wear. And that was about, what's that about? Why do they wear masks? Does anyone know? It's not about COVID. I wonder. It is covering their mouths. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, they don't want to commit harm to anyone. I didn't hear you very well. Could you repeat that?
Yeah. So they have this environment in which they want to avoid harm.
Yeah, so even a small animal like a bug, right? That's so they don't like inhale a fly accidentally. Like, they don't want to hurt a fly. We wouldn't construct squashing a fly as aggression or harm. There's a biology of aggression, as there is with all things in psychology. So there are genetic influences. So there are twin studies that would show that, let's say, identical twins have more similar level of aggressions. You say the Y chromosome, yes, generally people with a Y chromosome have higher levels of aggression. There are neural influences. So there's parts of your brain that when activated make you aggressive. Remember we talked about there was a scientist who put electrodes in animals' brains and then pushed a button. So when he positioned that somewhere in, I think it was the amygdala, he'd get the animal to react in an angry way. Aggression is more likely to occur with frontal lobe damage. What do your frontal lobes do? Yeah, and the inhibition of lower responses that might not be such a great plan. So after Phineas Gage got that railroad spike through his frontal lobes, he became more aggressive. Alcohol does the same thing. It inhibits those higher level functions. And so we see more aggression. To a point, right? There's a point where you drink enough that you can't do anything. But when you are still capable of aggressing and alcohol is disinhibiting your higher level functions, then you'd see an increase in aggression. And there are biochemical influences. The testosterone is linked with irritability, assertiveness, impulsiveness, and low tolerance for frustration. But I will add that in research where winning the game requires a cooperative response, the testosterone shot results in more cooperative behavior. That suggests that it might be more about winning, and fighting is one way to win. Frustration can lead to anger, and that can spark aggression. And so there can be a lot of little provocations that drive people over the edge. I think we had this example maybe in the second class about correlation and causation, that there's a correlation between ice cream sales and aggression. And that's not because ice cream causes aggression, it's because ice cream sales and aggression both increase with heat. And heat is one of those anger triggers, one of those provocations. What else? Insults, pain, bad smells, crowding. It's also a role of reinforcement for aggressive behavior and of modeling, of observing aggression in others. Have you guys heard of do you guys know what this is? I see one person say yes. Very famous. Yes, what is this? It's the Bobo doll experiment. And can you tell me about that? What happened in that experiment?
Show them like different like teachers. One was like kind of violent and one of them wasn't. And then the kids that like the kids that like had viewed
You're on it.
people like beating up this doll, they like
Yes.
probably like
Yes, you're on it. So the kids got to see, and they're randomly assigned to different conditions, but in one condition, the kids got to observe a frustrated adult taking it out on this Bobo doll. And a Bobo doll is not something people play with anymore, but it's a big plastic inflatable doll that has a weight in it and it sort of swings back and forth. So you can sort of punch it and it comes back and you punch it again. And in fact, none of the children who were in the other conditions where they didn't see the adult beat up the doll exhibited that behavior. They didn't do that. Yes, I saw a hand.
Just that on its first day, it wasn't the fact that the TV, it was just they received to lose toys. They had a negative stimulus.
Yes, you're right. So after the children had observed the adults either violently taking out their aggression or not, and then the kids were allowed to go play with the toys themselves, the experimenters did something to piss off and provoke the child. And the experimenter said, oh, you see these nice toys? They're not for you, they're for the other children. You can play with these crappy Tinker toys and Bobo dolls. And then that's what they use as the provocation to induce the child to show aggression. Yes, good point. Okay. As we know, social scripts are important. That's why we're doing this here right now, the way we are. And there are media portrayals of violence, and those do provide social scripts that people might learn to follow. And there's I'd say there's a good amount of research that suggests that viewing violence contributes to greater aggression and less helping. Okay. So now we did power and aggression. So back to prejudice. Scapegoat theory says that if we have some frustration or aggression that we want to get out, something's wrong and we need to blame someone, who does it make sense to blame? An equal status person, a higher status person, or a lower status person or group? Lower, yeah, and why is that? And okay, so you're saying that you wouldn't want to blame it on somebody higher status than you, and why not? Why wouldn't that be a great strategy? And you want to please them, right? The submissive wants to please the dominant. And the dominant person, the higher status person, can retaliate too if they're displeased. They could be angry. Why not blame it on an equal status person? They might have equal responsibility. Why do we pick a lower status person or group? Yes.
Because a lower status person is less likely to retaliate against the person.
Yeah. They can't fight back, right? If they try to argue, they can be silenced. That's the whole, yes, the whole key to it is that who is scapegoated is about their powerlessness or their weakness. It's that they're a safe target and they can't fight back. And who that is depends on who has the power in a given context. And there are many different contexts. So in a particular context, you could have, say, an able-bodied white man be scapegoated. Okay, that would indicate that in that particular setting, he doesn't have the power. And that can happen, and I have seen it happen. So prejudice refers to an unjustifiable and usually negative attitude towards a certain group and its members. It involves stereotyped beliefs, negative feelings, and a predisposition to discriminatory action. So what's a stereotype? A stereotype is a generalized belief about a group of people, and it can be accurate to some point. Like you could have a stereotype that women talk a lot, and it is actually true that women on average speak many more words than men in the course of the day. But that might be overgeneralized. Like it's not true that all women talk more than all men, and then be used inappropriately. And I think that's even more key to it. It's how that a fact becomes part of a story and what are you trying to do with that story. Discrimination is defined by your textbook as unjustifiable negative behavior towards a group and its members. Discrimination has two definitions. You notice that there's two meanings. So here's one, the unjust or prejudicial treatment of different categories of people or things, especially on the grounds of race, age, sex. And let's cue in on that word unjust. Okay. If you're a straight woman, you can discriminate against other women on a dating site, and that's not unjust. Still discrimination, technically, but it's not unjust. Also on the subject of just, what does that mean? What is justice? Kind of gets the idea of law. There is legal and illegal discrimination. It is illegal across the country to discriminate in employment on the basis of race. It is not illegal. It is legal to discriminate on the basis of criminal record or on the basis of social status. Let's say somebody looks like they're lower social status. What else? On the basis of body weight. There are provincial differences as well. So in Nova Scotia, it is legal to discriminate on the basis of criminal record, but it is not legal to do that in Newfoundland or in BC. The second use of the term discrimination it reflects that it's about the ability to recognize and understand the difference between one thing and another. Discrimination between right and wrong. You might recognize that from our unit on learning, on classical conditioning. The dog discriminates between two tones by not reacting to one of them. The dog shows that he knows these two tones are different. Okay, we're talking about bias and other unpleasant things in the next slides. There's explicit bias and then there's implicit bias. Explicit bias means that some folks are really obvious about their bias, okay? There is no question that this guy's a racist, right? It's blatant. Then there's also implicit bias. We might think that we're definitely not racist or definitely not sexist, but still act in ways that are, can be unaware of the attitudes that we have and how they influence our behavior and what impact they have. And we can read that in various ways. There's something called an implicit association test. And I posted a link to Harvard's IAT on the Brightspace page if you want to take that for a spin. Something you can see in reflexive body responses. It comes through in body language. And even in the way we treat people, it could be unconscious patronization, right? Like treating people from another group as if they were a child. Now, here's something that I think shows some implicit bias. It's from your student success textbook, Feldman and Lavoie. It's one of the chapters I didn't assign. And it's on decision making and being an adult. And yes, this is triggering. So it's about making decisions, okay? Being responsible, personally responsible for the decisions that you make. Talked about personal versus social responsibility. Finally, whatever decisions you choose to make, recognize that you and you alone are responsible for making them. Choosing to drive with someone who is drunk, texting while driving, leaving your drink at the bar while you go to the washroom. These are all examples of actions that could have dire consequences. Don't be tempted to blame others if things go awry. Whether your decision was hurried or carefully planned, whether it was right or wrong, whether or not you are happy about the outcome, you need to own it. You are accountable for making the decision, and the adult thing to do is to take responsibility for your actions. What's going on there? Can you see it? You look like you can see it. Yeah. That is exactly what they are saying. And it's about personal responsibility. So in this case, someone else has done something illegal. It is not legal to go and put some kind of drug that may be even a poison to that person. You don't know what kind of medical condition the person that's going to drink it has or how that could hurt them. And then they pass out and they get raped. And what are they saying? Don't be tempted to blame the person that did that. Really? You need to own it. You are accountable for making the decision. And the adult thing to do is to take responsibility for your actions. What does that mean there? What does personal responsibility mean there? They're saying, say this has happened to you, and now you're an adult and you have to take personal responsibility. Therefore, what might you do showing this personal responsibility? Yes. Yeah, so what are they suggesting? Do nothing. See how sometimes with a story, it's about how it advises the next action. And they're not saying, well, you should go see the sexual violence advisor, right? They're not saying, maybe you could file a police report. Not saying maybe you could sue the university. They're not going there, are they? So I would say that it also deflects from social responsibility. What is the social responsibility of, say, the institution or the organization in which this happened? Not looking at that at all. See how it deflects? Now, you won't find that in your ebook. It's still in the books that are in the library because I had them take it out, so it's been scrubbed. But just because you have one paragraph taken out of a book doesn't mean it changes the whole attitudes and values that's behind the chapters. And so there's a reason that I didn't assign certain chapters. And if you do read them, you'll find more stuff like that. Not that bad. Okay, but taking out one paragraph doesn't address the whole culture that got into why that was written. Okay, so I would say there's some implicit bias there. Here's another example. So one way that we can experimentally demonstrate discrimination in hiring is by sending off resumes to different job postings or to people who are pretending to be a hiring manager. Do that too. And they're all the same resume and they're all for the same jobs. And what we do is just change the name on top of the resume so that it sounds like the person is of a certain ethnicity. So Kyle is seen as being white, so is Matthew, but Tyrone is assumed to be black, and so is Deshaun. And if there was an Ahmed, he might be assumed to be Muslim. Get the idea, right? Then we look at the callback rates for the resumes, and we do see differences. Okay, that's been well replicated. And in the last study I did on this, there wasn't a single person that said they were rejecting the candidate because they had a black name. So when you ask why are you not hiring? None of them was like, it's because his name is Tyrone and I am racist. That never happened. What did they do instead? They found other things to pick on, right? They would sort of say, oh, he has the criminal record. There was definitely not as much caring about the criminal record when Kyle had it. When Tyrone had it, now it's a big problem, right? There's a history of low-level work, and 5 years of work as a longshoreman, and that's a sketchy job. Okay? Only resumes with the black names were criticized for their lack of professionalism in the writing. Okay? The formatting of the resume looks unprofessional, and the information that's presented is at times unclear. For instance, they didn't indicate that they graduated from high school, just that they went. See how like trivial and petty what they're picking on is? And these are the same resumes. This didn't come up for Kyle, ever, and there were hundreds of participants. The only resume that was rejected because the person could do better than this job came with a white name. The person wrote, unless the applicant had a physical disability, they'd be a poor fit for the monotony of this job. I don't know why somebody with a physical disability is a good fit for a monotonous job, though. I don't know where they're coming from with that. So I posted this on Brightspace, and so you can go and take the implicit bias test. Does anyone know how these tests work? No? They measure reaction times, okay? So let's say if I were to show you a white face, and you have to hit a key as soon as I then flash the word good on the screen. Okay, see the white face, see the word good, now I have to hit a key. We can measure that in reaction time, and it might be a few hundred milliseconds. Now, let's say that I show you another race face, and you see the word good. Will it take you a little longer to hit the key? And what would those reaction times look like if the word was bad? So it might be easier and faster for some people to make the white and good association. So it's based on reaction time. The targets of prejudice depend on context, right? Depends on who has the power in a certain context. So thin women are stigmatized in Mauritania, and larger women are stigmatized in the West. Muslims are stigmatized in North America and Europe, and non-Muslims are stigmatized in the Middle East. Ashkenazi Jews are stigmatized in North America and Europe, but not in Israel. So it goes back to who has the power. And at a really high level, you might ask who has built the system, structures in society for their benefits and interests, and who might be excluded or disempowered when they act in those systems. In organizations, bullying or harassment or discrimination tends to be perpetrated by those in power, right? It's a power thing, it goes with high level positions. And one of the things that I noticed is the way that, let's say if you've had some sexual violence workshops, they focus on a stereotype of the undergraduate male as a sort of alcohol-fueled sex beast. And what do they conspicuously not talk about? Okay, and welcome week. So I'll talk about what happens in residences and these very badly behaved boys. Have you ever heard them talk about faculty or administrators? I never have. Right? That conversation is conspicuously absent. And it makes me wonder, is that scapegoating? Now, the authors of your textbook are male, and so I don't know where they're coming from with comments like this. We could avoid 2/3 of all crime simply by putting all able-bodied young men in cryogenic sleep from the age of 12 through 28. That wouldn't really work as an intervention because, well, first of all, it would kill them. But even if you could put somebody in some type of stasis, they're not going to wake up 12 years later with the social and emotional skills and fully developed frontal lobes, right? Like it's not an ethical intervention. Okay, so I don't really know what to say in response to that. There's another one, and this was from I think it was week 2, and they say that men are more likely to hazard answers than to admit they don't know something. But then it's constructed negatively, a phenomenon researchers have called the male answer syndrome. And there's a reference, and it sounds like researchers are talking about this and it's a thing and there's journal articles about it. There's not, right? Go and follow that reference, follow it to the back of your book, look it up, you're not gonna find it. This has no currency in the psychological literature. So I'm not sure what's going on there, right? I definitely identify it as bias or prejudice. This is at the last page on your Feldman and Lavoie book, chapter 9. It says, on campus, anyone who feels that they're facing discrimination based on gender, ethnic background, etc., should contact a university or college official immediately. Often there's a specific office that handles such complaints. The important thing is to act and not suffer in silence. Discrimination is not only immoral, it's against the law. What is this assuming? Yes. Oh yeah, exactly. Exactly. Okay. It's assuming that it's safe. Speaking now as a student and as a survivor who went through these processes, I cannot in good faith recommend them to you. The process that I encountered was biased, was retaliatory and violating even of my legal rights. At one point, it looked like, as a consequence of reporting, that I wouldn't be able to finish my degree. Okay, obviously, I'm still here and I made it through that. But seeing this made me stop in my tracks. Okay, it made me think of what my personal responsibility is in letting you see that and sort of blindly trust that it's safe. Okay. I think that things are changing. I hope that things are changing, but it's not clear to me what has changed. I don't feel like I can say, yes, it's safe. It's a great process. Do it. This is also in your book, and I think it's very apt. And it's I don't know if it's pronounced Lenconi model or Lensoni, but just because there's a process or an office doesn't mean it's a good one. Just because there's a policy doesn't mean it's effective. Just because there's a program doesn't mean it makes things better. Okay, so there needs to be accountability. There needs to be attention to results. What happens to people who go through that process? Are their issues resolved? Are they satisfied with it? Or are they silenced and not allowed to talk about it? Okay. Now, reading the dragon stories from your career development assignment is, I'll say it's humbling and inspiring. And here's one, and it is shared with permission, okay? And she wrote, one dragon that I had to face head on in my career was dealing with sexual harassment in the workplace. At the time, there were a lot of people getting harassed by a group. And it was the point where they were warning each other. And she was approached and harassed by one of them. And she decided to speak out and talk to higher management about it. This opened a big can of worms, which resulted in a lot of office politics, dealing with HR and retaliation. But there were some positives that came out in the end. She learned how to deal with office politics, how to deal with HR, how to talk to people, how to encourage people to speak their truth in the workplace. Helped her when she started working on her leadership skills. She knew what it was like when other people came to talk to her about their issues and how to deal with those issues. She thought that it helped position her to help others. She had more empathy, made her more approachable for people who needed help in the same situation. And she wrote that as a result of fighting that dragons, HR did behind the scenes clean up some things. That often happens. The person that reports it might be retaliated against, denied, that definitely happened, and then they'll go fix things. But it never happened, okay? So she talked about office politics, and well, in an organization, you see these organizational charts that say this, this is the president, and then the vice presidents report to them, and blah, 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 all the way down the hierarchy. There are also something that's important they never talk about called a sociogram. And a sociogram is something that shows where cliques are. What's a clique? So cliques are groups of people who work together on the basis of mutual liking or trust. So there could be the case that, I don't know, this person over here and this person over there and that person over there all work together. And when that happens, when there's a lack of accountability and transparency in the process, what you find is that people can, in an organization, can circle the wagons to protect each other. Okay. An article by Barrett and Kernan in the journal Personnel Psychology explains that an organization's first line of defense against a person who has a discrimination claim is to counterclaim that that there was no discrimination. You remember seeing in your book that discrimination is illegal. If you're reporting to an organization, to management, that they did something illegal, that makes the complainant a legal threat to the organization. Okay, so the first defense is to say, it didn't happen. That was not what's happening. Actually, the problem was you. The problem is your behavior. And what we know about a manager's general perception of any worker or employee's behavior is that it's more about a generalized, vague, fuzzy like or dislike than anything about what they actually did, any real incidents. And so now the game becomes about constructing and justifying a negative perception of the target, right? As constructing them as a problem, trying to drag up complaints. Like, do you have any complaints about these? Has this person never done anything? That kind of thing. Gossiping, excluding, provoking them. That's the basis for retaliation that people encounter, okay? It was actually for that very reason that Flanagan developed something called the critical incident technique. Like, okay, you're reporting an incident. What was that actually? Okay, gave a set of systematic procedures by which a user could recall and describe how a given behavior actually impacted a specific outcome. So an organization is motivated to support and protect its own interests. Organizations with anti-discrimination statements do not discriminate less. So we've talked about those studies where we send off resumes and see what the callback rates are. Well, do you think an organization that says, oh, we welcome applications from women and digital blah, 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 do you think they have better callback rates? No, no difference. But you kind of have to say that. Irving's motto at one point was the tree growing company, because what else are you going to say? They're not going to call themselves the clear cutting company. Okay, so policies, an organization can have policies, but they might not be adhered to. Internal processes can be biased. Large organizations will have a legal services department. They have internal lawyers, budgets for expected lawsuits, and they make a risk management decision about what they're going to do that weighs the risk that someone will sue and the risk that this and how profitable it is to do that. Okay. So in an organization, complaints are kind of like political ammunition. So if there's a conflict in the workplace, is the manager really interested in the personal side of that? They might be interested in using it to kind of promote an agenda. Okay, so there have been serious complaints, therefore, this should happen, or this should not happen. Okay, so they're leveraged for change or control by management. Okay, and the interpretation of the complaint is subject to the political agenda of management. Some people in organizations are protected. Some people are not. Employees who reliably support the interests of management are the people who are going to be protected and promoted, sometimes even when they act unethically. So a complaint can be filed, but it's just dismissed, right? Labeled as vexatious, especially when there's no accountability or transparency for how complaints are reviewed. It's often best if it's somebody external from the institution who does that, okay? And the complainant can be discouraged, that didn't happen, intimidated. Now, sometimes you have employees who challenge or threaten the interests of management, okay? And they can be targeted with complaints, right? If they're disliked with management, management would rather see the back of them. Whistleblowers are a good example. Well, and let's say this guy is Ted. Has Ted ever made you feel uncomfortable? Oh, tell me about that. Like, they'll kind of try to drum up or drag up a complaint. So the way management treats complaints, discrimination, is quite political, and it reflects the interests of management, not the well-being of the survivor. Now, I'm sure you've all dealt with bullying at school, right? And bullying involves a power differential and an intent to harm. It happens in the context of a relationship. There's 3 forms of bullying. Physical bullying, that's when they throw you into the locker and take your lunch money. Verbal bullying, that's when they call you names. And social bullying, that's the gossiping and rumor spreading, and we're not going to invite her to the party thing, okay? If we look longitudinally at what happens to those bullies, physical and verbal bullies tend to sort of, well, they don't go so far, right? There's the ones that maybe end up in low-wage occupations, right? You can't talk like that and be a manager. Unfortunately, social bullies do well. Okay, it's quite an adaptive behavior, and it's easy, it goes under the radar, and it's easy to get away with. And so those folks might end up being your boss one day. So it can be helpful to understand how to manage that. Okay. People who are bullied in the workplace are usually not kind of bad employees, because those, then they can just get fired, right? There's no reason to take big risks, but they are usually potential high performers who kind of don't submit, or maybe they're whistleblowers. They're a threat in some way. In organizations, bullying gets tied up with managerial networks and with processes. So there might be processes for conflict resolution, but you can't assume that that's an unbiased process. That the HR person that's doing that process has been trained in investigation. They might be taken aside before the meeting and kind of given a script about you. Okay. So when bullying escalates through organizational processes, that's called mobbing. And mobbing has 5 stages. It starts with exclusion, and most people who are being mobbed don't know what's happening at that point. Okay, it's sort of gossip, stigma. The next stage is called petty harassment. That's when you have sort of verbal harassment, dressing down. What do I mean by that? Those sort of meetings with a boss where you're not treated very well, yelled at, accused of things, getting written up for silly things. A big cue is having the workspace moved. Okay, then you might sort of start looking at informal processes for discipline. And if this carries on and it goes on and on, eventually the target snaps, right? They finally are just so outraged that they say, I'm going to strangle you. And now you got him, right? For uttering a threat. And now the formal processes can be evoked. And the formal processes can also be biased internally to an organization. And at the end, it would result in the person being excluded from the workplace. So quitting, retiring, firing, becoming sick, or dying. Does anyone know who that is? That's Shannon Nickerson, psychology professor, or was once. She went on hunger strike to protest against harassment and discrimination here. I'm not sure that anything changed. All right. So that's the more difficult stuff, but now on to the nicer stuff. So how can we work together? There was a famous experiment called the Robbers Cave experiment. And in this experiment, the researchers had boys who were going to go to a camp, and they randomly assigned the boys into two groups. One of them were, I think, the eagles and the rattlesnakes. And they thought, well, can we get these boys to like each other or not? And what they did is they set up the boys to compete with each other. So the activities would be a tug of war between the eagles and the rattlesnakes, or some other competitive games. And what happened is that the boys started to really dislike each other. It had negative stereotypes about each other. And the eagles said the rattlesnakes are liars and they're terrible. And they even started like raiding each other's cabins. It was a destructive spiral. And the researchers, by the way, you would never get ethics for this now. That's why we talk about these old studies. Then they reversed that. Does anyone know? I don't know if you've heard about this study, but how they reversed it and they got the boys to like each other. They created fake problems like, oh no, the water tank is broken. Everybody has to pitch in to help. So they got them to cooperate on a shared goal. And that made them like each other, and they had more positive perceptions of each other. These principles were used in the jigsaw classrooms. So once upon a time in certain parts of the United States, the schools were segregated, right? This is the school for the white students, and this is the school for the black students. And desegregation was something that school psychologists had to address. They addressed it through, so they applied these principles in what were called jigsaw classrooms. And they taught the children in certain ways that, so they were in little groups or mixed groups. Each child knew something different, and they had to work together in order to solve the problem. And it took them about 6 weeks to have happy mixed kids playing on the playground together. Didn't happen the first day, but it was pretty effective. So that's the principle. Altruism is the idea of unselfish concern for the welfare of others. And we can get philosophical about what that means, about what unselfish means. So people are more likely to help when they notice an incident, interpret it as an emergency, and see that they have some kind of personal responsibility for helping. If all of those things don't happen, they might not help. Okay? More likely to be helped if you look worthy of help, deserving of help, or more likely to help women. We're more likely to help people who are similar to us. We're more likely to help if we're in a good mood, if we're feeling guilty, and if we're focused on others instead of being preoccupied. And happier people generally help more, so people with positive moods. There are philosophical arguments about altruism, right? Like, is that really that dangerous, risky thing done to help others that puts yourself at risk? Is that really a selfless act, or are you somehow getting something out of it? Sometimes people step forward and take a stand because they couldn't live with themselves otherwise, right? The anguish at not doing something can be overwhelming. It creates an inner drive that's relieved by taking that risk and stepping forward. Sort of a way that you can find the strength to do it. Does anyone recognize this very famous picture in social psychology? Her name's there. That's Kitty Genovese. This young lady was very tragically raped and murdered. And a lot of people heard her screaming in that alley in New York. And apparently no one did anything. But have you ever been at home and like heard a scream and then just Done nothing about it? I think I have. You're like, okay, maybe teenagers screaming, they do that. It's nothing. Someone else will deal with it. So this is called the bystander effect. Okay, there's a tendency for bystanders to not intervene. Okay, and we are less likely to help someone if there's other bystanders present, because maybe they'll do it and we don't have to. And that happens when there's a sort of diffusion of responsibility. So someone might sort of have a heart attack on a subway platform and there's all these people walking by, but hey, there's all those other people and I'm on my way to work. I don't need to do it. So to help, you have to notice that there's an incident. You have to think that it's an emergency and not that drunk guy passed out for the 25th time. So think this is an emergency that should be acted on. And then you have to assume personal responsibility. Okay, and then you might help. There are social norms for helping. There are social norms, social scripts that say, oh, you know, you shouldn't just walk past a child on the street that's asking for money. You should call social services and make sure they have somewhere safe to stay. Those are social scripts. We help people who we see as dependent. So we're more likely to help children or more likely to help the elderly. And there is also a reciprocity norm. There's an expectation that you know, somebody does something for you when you need help, then later on when they need help, you'll help them too. So conflict is normal and inevitable, but just like anger, it has to be managed adaptively and ideally in a way that results in an improved situation for everyone. Okay? And there are different conflict management strategies. One might be confronting someone, one might be avoiding it, just forgetting about it, and that all depends on context. However, conflicts can escalate destructively. The book refers to social traps, which is a situation where if people are pursuing their own self-interest rather than the good of the group, they can kind of get caught in mutually destructive behavior. And there's a tendency for each side in the conflict to increasingly demonize the other. So these images are from World War I. You can see that the Americans and the sort of Germans basically saw each other the same way. Okay, as sort of as mad brutes who were destroying civilization. They saw each other the same way. So it's not contact alone that reduces conflict, like putting people together who are in conflict isn't going to necessarily make things better. There needs to be cooperation, but that itself is true when there's equal status. And that's often not the case. Communication is important. And the book mentions that you know, a third-party mediator can facilitate communication. And that's a role that some people have in organizations. I highlighted it because it's making a big assumption. It's making an assumption that the mediator is, as mediators should be, impartial and unbiased. When you're in an organization and you have a conflict with your boss and the mediator works for HR who answers for management, that may not be the situation you're dealing with at all. Okay, there are a lot of assumptions here. And then there are processes like conciliation that can help parties that are about to go to war kind of de-escalate. So let's say one person does something a bit nice. Well, you don't have to respond, but you could. You can try to get parties back into that positive spiral. So how do you get people to work well together? Let's say in groups and teams. The Feldman and Lavoie book talks about Tuckman's team develop model that has these stages that at first your group forms. So think of, let's say, a group that's working together on a group project. And next, you know, when you form the group, you might think that things are all going well. The next stage is important because it suggests the conflict is inevitable. At some point, you're going to realize that you have misunderstandings, you have different goals, that you have weaknesses, and that leads to conflict. Then the group develops norms by which you manage those adaptively And then you can reach the stage of performing together. And finally, adjourning. So your Feldman and Lavoie book gives some tips on how to get through those stages as well as possible. So in the forming stage, share your expectations with each other. Talk about your strengths and weaknesses. I like writing, but I hate statistics. Talk about how and when and where you'll communicate, how you'll divide the workload, who's responsible for what. Understand that the storming stage is going to happen and that in life, you can dislike someone and someone can dislike you, and you can still work together. Right? Keep communication open. When it comes to sort of fights, I statements are a lot better than making accusations, even if the accusations are true, because the accusation make people get people's back up. Now you kind of get caught in a spiral. Okay, so diplomacy, looking for win-win solutions. Sometimes team members don't deliver, right? That happens. You've probably all had a group where somebody's slacking or social loafing. To prevent that, it helps to agree on internal deadlines. Everyone knows what they're accountable for, okay? And ultimately, sometimes you have to escalate your concerns to the instructor. Generally do that when you start to notice a problem that you're not managing effectively and not the day after the deadline, okay? Some instructors do peer evaluation where you can kind of give a bad grade to the person that doesn't perform. And then they say in your book that sometimes the instructor just isn't going to be understanding about it. And I would answer that, well, your instructor has a boss. You can go see them. Okay. It helps in a group to play to each other's strengths. So you have to know what those are, and then to cover for each other's weaknesses, and you all have them. Okay. And over time, people sort of settle into their roles. That's when they start producing. And then the last stage is adjourning. So maybe you want to get together after the grade received, to talk about what worked and what didn't. And if that went well, you might want to look that person up on LinkedIn, okay, and work with them again. There's some tips for facilitating team meetings, like how to keep an agenda, how to keep minutes. I don't know many undergraduates that actually do this. Does anyone do that? Well, the instructions are there if you want to, but having that can sort of keep track of who came to the meeting and what was decided, and what the topics are for the discussion and what the next steps will be. So they're quite functional. Listening is a skill, like listening to other people in your group. You can demonstrate that with eye contact, nodding, by acknowledging their contribution. So sometimes somebody says something and we just, it's like we don't react to what they said, and we just say what we want to say. You could say, well, you know, as Sarah was saying, and then link that in and integrate it, and it shows that you were listening. And you can kind of use reflective feedback to say, well, what I hear you saying is that what you meant? Sometimes people speak in symbols, and you have to read through the lines a bit. Be aware that we do work with international students. They're about something like 30% of our student body, and they might need a little bit more time to process. Right? When you say something, they might need a little more time to process that and a little more time to respond. And because we're not giving them those spaces, we can just kind of talk to each other and keep going and leave them out. We might be waiting for a chance to get involved and not getting it. So we have to intentionally make room. We all have a culture, so there's a section on cultural competence. And culture refers to learned behaviors, beliefs, and attitudes that characterize an individual, society, or population. And within a culture, we also have subcultures, okay? And maybe university is probably a bit of a preppy, upper middle class, very white culture, okay? Very able-bodied culture. It's very young culture. And that people who are not from that culture can feel like a fish out of water. Working class students can feel that way. They're not coming in having learned a lot of things that are otherwise expected by the culture, okay? And so there's a role for us in building bridges and listening and learning. And sometimes it's best not to make assumptions about who other people are. And once you've done that, you're in a position to think about accessibility and accommodations. and there might be something you need to do a little differently in order to include somebody. So I work with someone that is older, he's past retirement, and I've learned that I have to use really large font so that he can read it. All our documents are like 25-point font. I wouldn't know that if we didn't have a conversation. Okay. Any questions, comments? No? Okay. So for Sunday at 5 o'clock, you have your week 10 quiz. I have not written that yet. I think I'll have it up tomorrow. You also have an adaptive learning assignment. So that's 2 things. Please don't forget. This is an old slide. No, that is, we're not talking about the brain next week. But next week is Accessibility Week. And you can click that link to find out what's going on. There's a lot of interesting workshops and speakers. And I do want to remind you that today is the last day to drop the course via banner. So you can check where your grades are on Brightspace. And assignment 2 has now been graded for any students in kind of the bottom quartile. So they have that information back to help make a decision. Thank you for your attention. And I look forward to seeing you next week. Now I can hear you.
Okay.
How are you?
Good, good. That was really great.
Thank you. That was hard.
I know, but you were amazing. You did not nervous, you look confident, so I'm really proud of you.
Thank you.
That's gonna help a lot of people.
I hope so. It's also like discouraging them. Yeah, it's discouraging them from trusting the processes. I think I probably should have said something like, okay, knowing that this can happen, what can you do about it? And say, like, have psychological support before you go into it to say, yeah, that's what I would do differently. I think what I'd do differently is say, you know, you should report it because that's the only way that the organization will know and can do anything about it. But understand that there may be some unpleasant things like retaliation or silencing, and have the psychological support to get through that.
Exactly. Yeah, like I would want to know going in that it might not be the best experience, you know. So that's good for them to know.
Yeah.
Definitely is.
Yeah. Well, I can continue to develop the message as I hope things continue to improve here.
Yeah, I really hope so.
Me too. Okay. I'm gonna go write some test questions.
Okay, good
All
luck.
right.
See you
Bye.
tomorrow. Bye.